European region saw its population almost double between beginning of the 16th century and year 1750. This growth was followed by an even greater surge in population levels as Europe entered the era of the Industrial Revolution. But disease, malnutrition and wars could easily tip populations over into periods of high mortality. We must keep in mind that average life expectancy in the early modern times was still around 30 or 35 years of age. But this fact is just constructed by statistics. In fact, for individuals who made it through their first 5 years of life, the outlook was quite good. In general, those who lived to their early 20s could expect to live to their 60s, of course approximately, with some variations over time and space. But about 50% of pre-modern human beings died before their 15th birthday. That's the reason why the life expectancy as an average number was so low. How can we know that? In comparison to Middle Ages, we have got relatively precise data on demographic behavior and population change for large territories of Europe. Different political entities and self-governing bodies started to register their inhabitants for several reasons, among them especially taxation and control. Conscription and taxation data have their methodological limitations, as these sources were not created to come to an estimate of the complete population or its demographic features. There is, however, an almost complete lack of overall population surveys, such as censuses, until the end of 18th century. First pioneers could be found in northwestern Europe, in the countries such as Denmark, Iceland, Prussia, or Sweden. For most of the early modern period, however, scholars rely on partial datasets that were put down in writing for purposes other than surveying complete populations, while some of them, like parish registers, provide data that allows a better understanding of demographic features than many early censuses. These early modern sources all survive in highly scattered forms. Tax records do not concern wider populations, only individuals who had holdings and thus could be potentially taxpayers. Therefore, whenever precise population estimates are presented in the context of the early modern times, one must be very cautious with these figures. The model proposed by Thomas Robert Malthus in 1798 has been very influential in historical studies of population and resources. Malthus predicted regular crises since food production increases at a linear rate, whereas population tends to increase exponentially. Consequently, any increase in food production led to greater population growth, which would subsequently literally eat up any gains in living standards, thus trapping populations at low standards of living and on the edge of subsistence. The point at which the population outstrips the growth in food production, leading to scarcity, famine and disease, is referred to as a Malthusian trap or Malthusian catastrophe. What we know of the early modern period is that some moments were more Malthusian than others. European populations do indeed seem to have grown faster than food production, and living standards were negatively affected. But this view is very general. Particular regions of Europe had different history. On one hand, we can talk about a group of lands that include Spain, Britain or Poland, and these countries had steadily growing population levels over the early modern period, with substantial increases emerging in the 18th century. On the other hand, we can observe very different trends in France. There, birth rates and death rates fell in synchronicity with each other, leading to a far smaller cohorts of youngsters. This pattern can already be clearly observed over the course of the 18th century when French birth rates decline while those in England and Wales rise. If we want to grasp what happened in early modern times, we must watch two quantities: fertility and mortality. Fertility was high in the pre-modern context. In the absence of modern contraception, childbirth occurred frequently. Due to high levels of infant mortality, this level of childbirth might well have left couples with only 2 to 3 adult children, a level at or just above the replacement level for a population. However, certainly for the British case, the end of the early modern period is one of increasing fertility. For France, however, the opposite occurred. Data from British parish registers indicate that over the early modern period, the average gap between births dropped by 8%. This means that, on average, women had 3 fewer months between pregnancies, which, over the course of a lifetime, could significantly increase total fertility. And now about mortality. Death rates in early modern Europe gradually declined across most of the continent from the 11th century onwards. However, there were numerous exceptional periods tied to weather events or environmental crises, epidemics, and military conflicts, all of which could result in privation, malnutrition, and famine. In most cases, economic crises only affected particular polities, and in many cases, these led to the rapid economic development of other competing regions. While famines were recurrent in much of Europe up to the High Middle Ages, they became much more local phenomena by the late Middle Ages. However, they never fully went away. In particular regions, hunger could be catastrophic, such as in case of the Russian famine at the beginning of the 17th century, the Irish famine in the 1740s, or the Great Czech famine of 1770s. Also, wars affected regions differently. The late medieval and early modern wars of Ottomans in the Balkans and the Carpathian Basin, the wars of religion in France, and the 30 Years' War in German-speaking regions took a tremendous toll in those parts of Europe involved in the conflict, but other areas didn't experience these shocks to mortality. Epidemic diseases were also a significant cause of mortality. Smallpox, influenza, syphilis, malaria, and so-called sweating sickness were all present in certain phases of the early modern period, causing serious epidemics in some regions. However, none proved to be as lethal as the plague in the 14th century. It is important to note that mortality in general in this period hit children and women hardest. At the very end of the early modern period, some European countries began to experience demographic transition. This was a phenomenon whereby a drop in death rates wasn't not immediately followed by a drop in birth rates. And this feature led to a period of rapid population growth. For the 19th century, We have got much more sources in comparison to the early modernity. Census records became obvious practice in the vast majority of European countries. Progress of statistics was profound. And in the second half of the century, we can find also first attempts of research made by empirical sociology. In this period, Europe had broken free from the Malthusian trap. In its most stringent form, the demographic transition model divides the mechanism into 4 phases. The first phase is a steady state where birth and mortality rates are high. This is pre-modern world. In the second phase, the mortality rate diminishes while the birth rate remains high. This fact results in a growing gap between mortality and fertility rates. During the third phase, the gap between mortality and birth rates decreases, as after an initial lag, the birth rate starts diminishing too. And in the fourth phase, this is the moment when both rates get relatively close to each other again and enter a new steady state of low birth and mortality rates. This is not necessarily the end of demographic change, as will be discussed later in this presentation. In the last few decades, the determinism of the theory has been heavily criticized, as the timing, duration, order, and underlying reasons for the different phases of the demographic transition differ between countries. Moreover, the model is very descriptive and does not explain when or why people decided to have fewer children. Therefore, demographic transition model can best be seen as a descriptive mechanism, merely stating that at aggregate levels there is an association between decreases in mortality and fertility. Death was a much more common factor in everyday life for those born before the beginning of the 19th century. Mortality was especially high for small children, but malnutrition and lack of knowledge about especially preventive medicine made people susceptible to infection generally. Many infectious diseases could be lethal for any weakened adult. Yet over the course of the 19th century, the impact of epidemics diminished. With the improvement of hygiene, living conditions, preventive medicine, and public health, infectious diseases began to lose ground at the end of the century. Increasing understanding of the role of hygiene, especially, had a significant impact on the trends of infant and child mortality. Timing and pace of the mortality decline differ by country. In Sweden, for example, mortality decreased throughout the 19th century, whereas in Switzerland or Netherlands it took until the second half of the century before mortality rates began to drop. The decreasing mortality was most noticeable for the youngest in society, and it was the decline in infant and child mortality that generated significant population growth. Economic wave in the second half of the 19th century created a favorable opportunity for agricultural areas in Eastern Europe. The increase in production also brought positive changes in distribution of food, as transportation was revolutionized by stem hauling. An improvement in living conditions was brought about by a more balanced diet and increasing knowledge of preventive medicine. The trend in fertility is more complex than the trend in mortality. Demographic transition theory doesn't consider regional variations. The decline in fertility in Western European states began as early as the 1870s and 1880s, while in Central Europe the same trend started at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, so about 20 or 30 years later. Yet territorial differences can't simply be explained by the west-east slope of economic and cultural processes. On both sides of the divide, we can see much more differentiated processes. Fertility transition started first in anti-traditionalist revolutionary countries and was thereafter widely adopted across Europe, reaching traditionalist religious countries last. In Hungary, for example, decline in fertility started almost at the same time as Western Europe, and even before the decrease in mortality in Hungary. It was somewhat later than France as the pioneer in the fertility transition, but much earlier than religious conservative countries like the Netherlands, where fertility decreased rather slowly and remained relatively high well into the 20th century. The different timing of fertility decline across Europe is at odds with demographic transition theory and highlights that the mechanisms underlying the demographic modernization differed across the continent. Social stratification and rural-urban differences were probably a more important indicator for the fall of birth rates than the country of origin. In urban contexts, upper and middle classes usually limited the number of their offspring earlier than laboring classes. In the countryside, farmers, farm laborers, and peasants generally continued having large families and only started decreasing their family size during the 20th century. If we want to talk about demographic transition, we must keep in mind the impact of Industrial Revolution too. According to estimation based on military conscriptions, there was a decrease in the average height of the recruits in the first half of the 19th century, a phenomenon that emerged with the wave of the Industrial Revolution that went hand in hand with accelerating population growth. Wage work provided resources for an increasing number of households and drew ever-increasing scores of people to the cities. Urbanization meant the relocation of large numbers of people to hygienically unsatisfactory conditions. Cities suffered from overcrowding and pollution, had limited water supplies, and were ideal vectors for infectious diseases. The average height of London craftsmen in 1840s was between 5 and 7 centimeters lower than in 1750. Similarly, the infant mortality rate rose during the first half of the 19th century in British industrial cities, even though it had slowly fallen during the second half of the 18th century. This confirms older historiography that the standards of living stagnated during the Industrial Revolution, or they became a bit worse. In the long run, however, the growth of per capita income during the 19th century undoubtedly had a positive effect on the well-being of the population. Higher personal income improved the quality of life as it made better housing, nutrition, and hygiene affordable. Households were enabled to reach a desirable level of living, which improved their own and their offspring's survival chances, setting the wheels of the demographic transition in motion. Simultaneously, incomes of governments and public authorities grew too. This allowed administrations to invest in much-needed improvements in public hygiene through water pipes and so on. As such, industrialization both introduced new social and health problems, but also gave the economic means to solve them. Slower, longer, less visible, and equally important was the revolution in agriculture that started in the 18th century. The rapidly growing populations were fed by agricultural innovations as crop rotation replaced the medieval open field and three-field system. New plants such as potatoes and corn were produced. Modern machines like seed drills and threshing machines were invented, and artificial fertilizers made more land fertile. Simultaneously, steamships and railways introduced a transport revolution which enabled Europeans to cheaply import food from overseas, especially since the last 3 decades of the 19th century. Finally, there were also rapid medical innovations in the second half of the 19th century, such as the discovery of bacteria and parasites or the development of preventive health care. Combined with economic growth, these factors allowed for rapid demographic change in the 19th century. As it became evident that populations had escaped from the Malthusian trap, European states started to value population growth as sizable. Healthy populations mean a stronger military and economic presence. The stage was set for a new era, age of the 20th century. If we want to talk about the demographic development of Europe in the 20th century, these issues could be grasped by 2 indicators. Firstly, the rate of natural demographic increase and decrease, such as birth and death rates, which was also shaped by external factors such as wars, plagues, and forced migrations. Secondly, in order to explain the more intrinsic dynamics of demographic change in Europe, all the other factors of the changing Human Development Index must be taken into account, such as health, knowledge, education, and economic wealth. Demographic history of Europe in the 20th century can be divided according to 3 historical breaks. The first break was the First World War. As the second break can be taken the following military conflict, the Second World War, that took place in Europe between years 1939 and 1945. And the third one, although much more peaceful, has been a coming of post-industrial society in the last quarter of the 20th century. And this so-called second demographic transition is the demographic regime of our times, in which we are still living. During the long 19th century culminated the first demographic transition. And generally speaking, in years, or better said, in the decades before the First World War, we are confronted with its termination. This end can be described by a gradual decline in birth rates that had started in the vast majority of European countries during the last 3 decades of the 19th century. In the less industrialized countries, natality had just peaked during the 1880s and 1890s, for example in Serbia or Romania, or at the beginning of the 20th century, like in case of Bulgaria. But then, these countries were confronted with the fall of natality too. The fall of the birth rate in the Western and the Central European regions culminated during the First World War due to military service of fathers, uncertainty of the economic conditions, and starvation as well. After a short wave of post-war compensatory birth postponed due to war, the decades of the 1920s and especially the 1930s were considered as the age of population depression by many contemporaries. In total, the First World War took an estimated 17 million people's lives all over the world. Additionally, it is estimated that the 3 waves of Spanish influenza pandemic killed more than 50 million people, when the world population was estimated to be less than 2 billion. Population losses in the countries involved in the war were higher. For example, in Germany or Hungary, 4 times more people died as a result of the war than from influenza. But in other parts of the world, the opposite situation prevailed. Although the interwar period meant the decline of emigration from Europe immediately after the war, population movements were considerable due to the disintegration of the empires. Austria-Hungary, Germany, and also former Russia disappeared. In the second half of the period, increasingly extremist right-wing demographic policies inspired by racist conceptions spreading from Germany especially put an increasing migratory pressure on the Jewish population of the region. Feeding from the same ideological mainstream of that time, many political leaders started to adopt more ambitious demographic policies. This resulted in both the formulation of various population growth theories and, primarily but not exclusively, in the losing countries for pronatalist policies which increasingly took on a militaristic character. The Great Depression of the 1930s only intensified an atmosphere of concern over the demographic development of Europe due to the fall of birth rate caused by economic insecurity of large numbers of families. Population policies became the subject of passionate discussions. At one end of the debate stood the populationists who were seeking to promote the growth of the birth rate. At the other end were the so-called neo-Malthusians, who promoted low fertility through contraception in order to improve living standards of the lower classes. Not only the quantity but also the quality of the population became an important issue of the time. Eugenics belonged to scientific discourse everywhere. Although there were some incentive demographic policy measures, it was the reduction of the mortality rate that became crucial in the population growth of Europe until the mid-20th century, which was driven primarily by the decline in infant mortality. For example, while in the interwar period the average infant mortality in Sweden was 54 per 1,000 newborns, the number was 142 in Poland. In the post-war period, took place a gradual decrease of these indicators while regional differences persisted. At the beginning of the 1970s, the ratio fell to 11 in the case of Sweden and to 30 in Poland. The word boomer or baby boomer is derived from developments after the Second World War when birth rates rose and the economy flourished. The baby boom that arose in the United States or in Canada was milder in Europe. An important indicator of the quality of life is life expectancy, which rose throughout the 20th century, although unevenly across Europe. Its average rise was between 2 and 3 months per year due to medical improvements as well as growing living standards during the 20th century. Satisfactory growth trends were visible in the western as well as in the eastern parts of Europe during the 1950s and 60s. Divergence was evident only in the 70s and 80s, when this indicator in countries of the Eastern Bloc grew significantly more slowly or stagnated, if not even declined, as in the case of the Soviet Union. Many historians classified the decade of the 1960s as the period of the sexual revolution, that is sometimes called second sexual revolution. Its typical features were a higher degree of sexual permissiveness, female sexual autonomy, and decriminalization of homosexuality. One very important factor with respect to the liberation of sexual relations was increased access to contraception throughout the 1960s. In the second half of the 1960s, hormonal contraception became more available, at least in the West. The lack of foreign trade and other economic barriers in the countries of the East meant that access to the pill were scarce. Scarcity of effective and comfortable contraception caused higher levels of abortions, consequently. The number of people living in Europe grew without respect to declining fertility. Today, the population is 25% larger than in 1960. However, this has been the case mainly due to Europe's positive migration balance. Decline in fertility observed from the mid-1960s had been indicated by some demographic analysis as the process of the second demographic transition. Its guiding features can be considered sustained sub-replacement, fertility, population aging, and the plurality of family arrangements other than marriage. Marriage, in the meantime, had changed in nature as with the spread of extramarital birth and domestic partnerships. Delayed entry into parenthood has become a typical feature. At the beginning of the 21st century, first-time mothers were more than 5 years older than in 1970. In the Western countries, the onset of transition was longer and more gradual. For the countries behind the Iron Curtain, the process was delayed, but then became much more dynamic during the 1990s. At the beginning of the 20th century, one quarter of the world population lived in Europe. At the beginning of the 21st century, it was less than 1/8. Although the outlook is less pessimistic now than in the 1990s, the population decrease of Europe caused by the second demographic transition is not going to be overcome in the following decades. Immigration became the most important source of the European population growth long before the last decades of the 20th century, and it probably will not be any different in the future.